Welcome back everybody to the My Generation podcast. On today's episode of the show, we are talking all things board games. We've discussed a little bit of board gaming before, and in the episode with Luke Hill a few weeks ago talking about his music creating process, I punted asking for someone to talk about board games, and Luke said he knew just the person, and it was Daniel Collins. Welcome to the show, Dan.
Hello there.
How are you today?
Yeah, no, pretty good. Excited to be talking about board games. Something I regularly do, but collective groans usually from my friends rather than excited listening.
Well, this is the space for it. So if you're interested in board games, this is the episode for you today. We've also naturally got our features that we have every single week here on the My Generation podcast. We've got Sammy Bacon, who comes on with a music review every week, Harry Monday, who does his film reviews, and then we've got our newer features. We've got Emma, who does poetry readings, Joe doing video game reviews, and Tom's pirate profiles. Very excited to share all that later on in the show. So, Dan, I just wanted to start really with who are you, whereabouts in Kent are you based, and where do you usually go to play board games?
So, I guess in terms of who I am, I'm just a board games enthusiast, really. It's one of these ones where I've spent a lot of my sort of adult life, and sort of younger life actually, playing board games. I'm based in sort of North Kent, Faversham area. And then where I go to play games, often I don't go anywhere. I have a very healthy collection of my own. I sort of try not to think about how much money I've spent on board games over the years, but in the upside, it means I have a very nice collection, which frequently means that I sort of host nights where friends come over, we have a few drinks, play a few games. Sort of more recently, though, I've started playing with games with people at work. Although now we're in a lockdown, that sort of had to be put to one side, unfortunately. But for that, we sort of went to just sort of a few local pubs, which we know they have sort of good sort of table space, and sort of on quieter nights, we know that we can kind of put ourselves in a corner or in like a little side room somewhere, and sort of play a few games.
Lovely. Well, yeah, I think that obviously we're recording this on the 25th of May, so still with social distancing in place, and so obviously that makes board gaming a little bit more difficult. But have you sort of been able to translate some of that online so that you can still keep up with your community of people who you host these nights with?
I don't actually have any sort of virtual board gaming at the moment. I have to sort of switch on to a few role-playing games using some online resources, virtual tabletops that way, because it tends to be slightly sort of easier for people to sort of access that way. But yeah, no, unfortunately, board games over this time have actually gone to all but like a dry up on that sense. Although I do know that there is some out there. And actually, I mean, I say I haven't, but with my family, we've been playing through a game called Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective, like a Sherlock Holmes mystery that you have to just sort of solve. And one of the nice sort of elements of that is doesn't really like have a board or pieces. It's more of a sort of narrative that you explore. And you sort of look up like different places you can go to, and you sort of uncover sort of clues and bits and pieces. So we've been doing that over like Skype and various sort of online talking platforms, because that's what you need to. That's what it is. It's a discussion game. You sort of read out a paragraph of text, and then you start deciding what you want to do. So during lockdown, unfortunately, board gaming is at a minimum at the moment.
Yeah, well, it's great you've still been able to make something of it, and yeah, once we're able to sort of go back to more of a normal, then they'll sort of resurge again. But for you then, well, what is it specifically that makes board gaming so special as opposed to, being able to play video games or do anything else? What's this genre's thing?
I think for me, I think this is possibly a reason why I haven't pursued it so much online, is it's very much sort of the interaction that I enjoy more, because obviously there's huge sort of similarities when it comes to like video games in terms of like what you get out of it. You maybe don't get quite so much of the fast adrenaline pace that you get with like first person shooters and stuff, but a lot of like getting into like the nitty gritty sort of mechanical side of it is still there. But yeah, the big difference with board games is you have the face-to-face interaction, you have the playing off other people, you have the adapting to, you might want to play a game a certain way, But actually, when you're sitting down at a table with a new group of people or a slightly different set of people, you might have to very quickly and sort of adapt how you're playing this game, because a lot of the times, strategies rely on what other people are doing. So if people start doing things that you don't necessarily expect, or let's say you play with new people and they're doing new things, you can't just, I'm going to do this, because you actually have to play off other people, which means it's that really interesting sort of social sort of side of it, when you're sort of bouncing off other people's ideas and running with sort of ad hoc strategies to games which otherwise could get stagnant if you played with the same people. But the slight addition of changing even just one or two players can sometimes just make a completely different game.
Yeah, and I like what you said about sort of newer players coming in, where they'll be trying out things that maybe the game wasn't necessarily designed for, and trying to put new spins on it, and you've got to just adapt to that. That's awesome. I mean, I like again what you said about the sort of social space, because for me, there's a place in Canterbury called the Dolphin, which was a great place for me to go and spend time with friends playing board games, because they had a collection there. They had really good table space, and it was quite a calm environment to go and play board games. For you then, obviously hosting it from home, what's it like hosting a board game night from your house?
Kind of stressful sometimes. It sort of depends on the scale of it. Most of the time it's around sort of 4 or 5 people, so it's kind of relatively low key in that sense. Obviously snacks are an important part of it, making sure everyone's got finger food, and also the correct choice of finger food is something else, because obviously you don't want to pick something that gets everyone's hands dirty and greasy, because then obviously they're going to be mauling your nice boards, leaving them in a state. But yeah, sort of just making sure everything's set up. And then obviously the other one is game selection. It can also be quite a stressful one. So there's with my sort of old friends, the friends I've had since sort of secondary school, they've been exposed to some fairly vigorous board games in their time. So I know if I'm hosting a night where we're all coming together, I can sort of crack up the big guns, as it were, some of the slightly more complex, slightly more in-depth games. Games that take sort of 4 or 5 hours to play. And I know that they'll enjoy it, and I know that they'll get it, and also that they already know the rules. Whereas if I'm playing a sort of game with some perhaps sort of fresher faces, or people who are maybe a little bit less experienced, choosing the right spread of games, having some games that are just, half an hour, kind of break the ice, get you into the flow of the game, and then you sort of move into the slightly heavier slightly heavier games. You don't jump straight into the deep end, and then over time you start introducing sort of more bigger and in-depth games. Because the other side of it as well is, the first 2 times you play a game, it's as much about learning the rules than it is about learning the game, learning the strategies and learning what people can do and learning different ideas. So the other one is when you play a new board game, you kind of want to play it 2 or 3 times potentially. And obviously, if you're playing in an evening for 4 or 5 hours, you don't have time to sit down and play a 5-hour game multiple times. But that's where, when you get those groups of players that are sort of more reliable and have learned the rules, and you do get that game where you do play that sort of 4-hour session, and everybody knows what they're doing and everybody's on the ball, it's sort of that extra special, because it takes quite a lot of work to get to that point in a lot of ways.
Yeah, well, it's interesting having those games at different tiers. It's really like you're planning almost a full event for people. It's all sort of stuff, someone like me, I wouldn't even think about, making sure you have the right finger food for a board game night. It seems incredibly important.
Yeah, obviously it's one of these ones where it's a road paved with many mistakes on my part. I've learnt the hard way in some cases. But the other thing as well is, obviously, as much as I'll be okay, I'll get a few games out, I think I know what will be a good idea, a lot of the times the people I invite will bring their own games, and some of these games I've not played before, in which one I'm oh, that sounds cool, let's do that. So it's also, again, it's I've got this idea for a game, how does everyone feel? Everyone up for that? Yeah, cool, we'll play that. So it's also, as much as I might quote-unquote plan something, it's also as sort of changeable as everything else, because someone else might bring something, and which point you go, okay, we'll do that instead. So I've had evenings before where it's been completely, not derailed, but what I had planned in my head didn't end up playing out at all, because, that sort of that morning, or even the day before, someone bought a brand new game and has brought it along, and so we played that instead, sort of thing.
Interesting. Well, it's good it has the sort of capacity to to change the evening based on that. It's not like a rigid structure. That's really cool. So I did want to ask them, what were some of your favourite games at the different tiers of difficulty and complexity? So if someone's listening to this and maybe they're new to board games or intermediate or used to those, as you said, sort of 5 or 6 hour games, could you maybe recommend a game or two at each sort of tier of that list?
Now, see, I knew you were going to say something like this, so I've been thinking about this quite a lot over the days. And one of them, I'm so bad for indecision when it comes to that side of it. So one of the nice things, sort of a more recent like development, is like just board games have got so much better in the more sort of recent years. Don't get me wrong, there's still some bad ones out there, but generally speaking, like there are some games out there that are just so very good. Sort of at a lower end, there's a game called Exploding Kittens. Now the game itself takes about sort of 5 to 20 minutes. Like, it is such a fast game to play. It's a really simple concept. It's basically don't draw a certain card from a deck of cards, and then that's kind of like the whole game. Like, you just play the whole game trying to like not die effectively. But through the mechanics of the game, it's just such a game where you just get to mess with other players, which makes it just hilarious. And it's one of these ones where it's a really nice game to play with like new people, because the mechanics of the game force you to kind of be kind of mean to other players around the table. Like, it kind of forces you to kind of try and get people a little bit. But because it's a game and it's so fast paced, it doesn't feel so bad when you do just kind of kill someone. Like, you just go, ha, I get you. Because the games are so short, you kind of go, oh, that was awesome, let's play again. And then you're like, I'm going to get you back. So it's that sort of, it's a really nice icebreaker, really sort of simple, easy rules. And it's a really quick way to start. And also, I think with newer players as well, there's a sort of familiarity with like card games. Because it's not, there's not too many rules. Any of the extra rules you need are often just written on the cards, at which point you really need to say when you're like explaining it is, read the card. Like, literally, that's all you need to do. Sort of no additional sort of rules beyond that point. So that's sort of one of the games that I sort of always sort of bring with me. Because the other side of it as well is it's effectively just a deck of cards. Obviously, it's not your regular playing cards, but crucially, it's really small and transportable. It's not this big, bulky game. It's really small, really compact, and just sort of takes it where you need to. It
seems like quite a good game for the sake of its efficiency as well, being able to just carry that around. I imagine some of these more complex games need a bit more setup as well, so you need to have the room and space, whereas this, feels like you can almost play it anywhere.
Yeah, again, that's sort of one of the strengths of that game is, like, I've had games of it waiting for a train, so like just at a train station, just sort of just quick pop it on the mic, play it onto like a bag effectively, and it's nice and quick and easy and straightforward. Sort of moving up from that in terms of sort of complexity, a game that I kind of found out about maybe sort of 3 or 4 years ago, so a relatively recent one in my mind, is a game called Flamme Rouge, which is red flag in French. It's a game where it's basically you're basically in a bike race. So you're just trying to like get from point A to point B, and whoever gets to point B first wins. Which again is a very sort of like, for anyone sort of new to board gaming, it's a very sort of simple concept, because everyone's like, it's that sort of snakes and ladder sort of principle. I get there first, therefore I win, which makes it not a hard game to pick up. It's the sort of the thing I like most about it is it's got the first sort of smatterings of like strategy, like complexity. So basically, obviously, in a race, you want to go as fast as you physically can. Like, whoever gets there first wins. So obviously, you want to go as far and fast as you can every time. But basically, there is sort of a built-in exhaustion mechanic, which effectively means that in order to be sort of safe, you want to go slower. You don't always want to go as fast as you can, because that's going to end up works out bad for you. So it's one of these ones where the mechanics actively work against the strategy a little bit, which gives you this interesting push-pull mechanic feel where you're kind of trying to ride that line of going as fast as you can whilst not going too fast. And it's one of these ones where I played it, again, it's a nice sort of quick game, sort of maybe sort of half an hour to an hour. Sort of an hour would be a longer game. It's fairly sort of standardly around half an hour, so sort of 40 minutes. and I've played a few games of it, and at first sometimes it felt just random, like kind of like, well, who won randomly, but apart from, because it's filled with choice, like because you're choosing every step of the road on that sort of in the game, it can't be random, like it has to have a degree of strategy. And then this is where, playing with other people and seeing how other people play completely changes how you want to play. So if somebody else just starts going super fast, it suddenly gets a lot better for everyone else to go super fast. But again, so it's one of these ones where it's got that first sort of scattering of sort of deeper strategy, coupled with a bit of sort of playing off players, whilst keeping the mechanics simple enough that it's easy enough to understand, and also it's like the core principle of the game is get across the finish line first.
And is this a team game, or is this a game you're playing on solo?
So this is it's a game that you're supposed to play against other players. So it's up to, I believe the core game is up to 5 teams. So each player has a team of riders, and it's up to 5 players. There is an expansion out there, which that means you can play it solo, as well as adding in an extra 2 teams. No, it's 4 players base, and you add 2 teams, so you can go up to 6 players. That's right.
Oh, amazing. Well, yeah, that sort of covers the moving into the more, if you've got a small group of people, but you want something that takes a bit longer to play. That sounds like a fascinating one. So now we're starting to move into something a little bit more complicated. A game that's going to last maybe a couple of hours. If you're fairly experienced with board games, what would be the next recommendation?
So I'm going to go a little bit old school with this one. Like, my recommendation for this is a game called Shadows of Camelot. Now, this game is a bit of a retro game. I can't remember exactly when it's from, but it's quite an old one. Basically, it's a semi-cooperative game, Shadows of Camelot, and so this is something that is a bit of an Achilles heel for me, in the sense of I'm very sort of fond of effectively a traitor style game. There's so many out there. Some games have done it so well. There's some very, very good sort of games out there when it comes to the traitor mechanic, which is basically where, to begin with, everybody sort of feels like they're working towards the same goal, but like secretly one of you is actually looking to undermine everyone else. But the big one is nobody knows who the traitor is. Like, it's that you kind of are overly critical and observant of everyone and waiting to see what, you're over-evaluating everybody's moves. So with Shadows of the Camelot, the story is you're the Knights of the Round Table, sort of King Arthur and his sort of loyal knights. And basically you've got to go complete various quests. So there's like fighting invading armies, protecting Camelot, finding the Holy Grail, getting Excalibur, sort of all those sort of classic sort of quests. Killing a dragon is another one. But it's one of these ones where, for the most part of it, it's the players versus the game. So the mechanics of the game are set up in such a way that, eventually the board game will win. Like, if something happens, if a certain sort of condition is met, the board game wins, in which case everybody loses. Apart from, they say they've got this traitor mechanic, and so basically the traitor, whoever is the traitor will also win if the board game wins, effectively. Like, they want the knights to lose. And because there's all these different sort of quests you can go on, and it's all about sort of hand management, so you have like hands of cards that allow you to do different things, but that's all sort of secret information, because obviously your hand of cards is, only you know what you've got, so there's a lot of like concealed information. So it's one of these ones where the different actions that people do can be very sort of suspicious, but the thing is these are also things that have to be done. So it's one of these ones where there is a very sort of plausible deniability when it comes to that, because you're kind of like, well, no, I'm doing what the game wants me to do, and you're like, yeah, but doing it with a little bit too much glee. So again, it's one of these ones where, because it has that sort of layer of social interaction, you've got that kind of like playing with new people can completely change how the game plays. So I've had games before where I've played with somebody a little bit, someone newer, and they started doing something, and I was like, that is such like a traitory thing to do. I was so certain that person was a traitor. I was like, yes, definitely, you're a traitor. Apart from when it got to that point in the game when I could accuse somebody, and I did, it turns out he was loyal, and he was just basically being a little bit selfish. But I was so just like set in my ways of how to play this game that it completely was like, oh, I'm sorry, which is just sort of bad. And then sort of my favourite bit about the sort of Shadows of Camelot is the way that the game is kind of set up. Now, I know different people play with sort of different house rules on this regards, but I really like this element, which is basically when you set up at the beginning of the game and you give people's loyalties out, you're supposed to build the deck of like loyalty with one traitor card and as many loyal cards as there are players. So basically, once you finish dealing out, there will always be one card left over. So there is actually the potential for you to play this game without having a traitor, like because then you're meant to keep that one card, you know, a secret, and you put it back in the box, so you don't know what the last card was. So it means that you could spend the entire, and again, I've had games like this, you spend the entire game like analysing everybody's moves, kind of not fully accusing them, but being a bit like, oh, that's a very suspicious thing to do, rah, rah, rah. And then at the end of the game, it just transpires we were all just attacking each other for no reason. Like, we were just being into each other the whole time for, like, no benefit, and we were just being horrid people. Which, yeah, it's a nice dynamic to it, because it does mean that sometimes you know that you just sort of, like, I don't know, just like overdoing it. The other reason I kind of love this game is I do have a bit of a record amongst my friends, because I always play as King Arthur, because, I don't know, it's my game and I like playing as King Arthur. But I have a bit of a reputation, and it is like 80% of the time that if I'm playing as Arthur, I am the traitor. So it's one of these ones where for me, it's always a bit of an uphill struggle, because I'm always having to, like, defend. Like, no, guys, trust me, I'm loyal. Because it's also a bit of a running joke, which is, how can the king be the traitor? Surely that means everybody else is the traitor. Like, what?
Oh, that's amazing. Well, I think in a minute I'd like to go into even more of some of the more complex ones, but that seems like a really great intermediate. How long does that game last?
So a good game of that, it will be about sort of an hour and a half to sort of 2 hours. It's one of these ones where, because there's so much table talk, whilst the mechanics of the game won't last, like if you just sort of sat there silently playing the game, it probably wouldn't last that long. But the game relies so heavily on table talk that it can, sort of drags it into that sort of hour and a half to sort of 2 hour style game. Again, depending on the size, because the other strength of it is it can play at sort of 3 to, I think, 8 is the maximum. So you have up to 8 players sitting around the table, all evaluating what everybody's doing. And obviously, as you add more players, the likelihood of there being a traitor increases, because it's one of these ones where, you know, once you've got 8 people, you've got a 1 out of 9 chance of there not being a traitor, at which point you're like, there's almost certainly a traitor.
Oh, interesting. Well, see, games like that I've always found extremely interesting. I think is it called, have you played Midnight Werewolves? Is it Midnight Werewolves?
One Night Werewolves.
One Night Werewolves, that's the one, where obviously there's 2 people, everyone's sort of working with different objectives, and I'm a big fan of games like that. I've played that many times where... So Shadows of the Camelot was one of the first games to really sort of try out this traitor mechanic idea. And I mean, since then, it has been taken and used and made into like 1,000 like fantastic games, and I could super easily write a list of like my top 10 like favorite traitor games, but I wanted to sort of talk about some slightly different ideas and mechanics out there. But yeah, like One Night Werewolf is a fantastic game. It's quick, it's fast paced, it's funny, it's like, it is a wonderful game. And again, I've played that game to death, like so many games with this, because again, it's one of these ones where it's like a bit, so it would fit into sort of the same range as sort of Exploding Kittens. It's that sort of quick game. So what happens is you play a game, you go, oh, that was really, really fun, let's play another one. And you just sort of sit back, you go back, you set the boards up, you know, set the pieces up again, and you play for another one. And then you go, oh, that was still so fun, let's do it again. Because each time you get a different dynamic, because people are playing different roles and different objectives. Yeah, I feel like the replayability of those games is so important. I've had evenings where me and friends have played One Night Werewolf almost exclusively the whole night, just because of the amount of change up of roles. And when you start going towards sort of the maximum cap of players, I think we've had nights where like I think, is it 8 players or 10 players can play it? Well, we've had the maximum, and because you've got so many different configurations of people, it can last a whole night of games if you want it to. So I wanted to go back to Dan in just a moment to continue continue this. We're going to sort of dive into the even more complex games in just a moment. But before we do, I've got the music and film feature here on the My Generation podcast every Thursday at about 20 to 25 minutes into the show. So Sammy Bacon is our local Kent music enthusiast. He comes onto the show every single week to bring us an album recommendation. And here is the album that Sammy recommends this week.
What's going on, everybody? Daughters, you won't get what you want. Daughters' fourth album, possibly, that doesn't matter. This was released in 2018 and is one of the most harrowing, brutal and brilliant albums I've ever heard. It's this noise, industrial rock album, and lyrically it's like, the lyrics in this track are beautiful. It's like Tom Waits, Nick Cave crossover. If that means anything to you, you'll know what I mean. If you don't, then just these lyrics are dark and poetic and beautiful. This band is not to be confused with Daughter, who are like a folky band. They are also alright. Daughters, you won't get what you want. Set in a way, long road, no turns, less sex, city song. This isn't an easy listen, but if you like your heavy music, if you like poetic lyricism, do check this out. I would kind of encourage a lot of people to see this because I think it's just a brilliant album. It's kind of like the soundtrack to trying to not go insane. This album is just amazing. It's such a, I don't know, you really get into it like physically, I guess, just so exhausted by the end of this album in a really good way, and that might put some people off, but this album is just fantastic. It's not one of those albums you listen to all the time. You can't listen to this album all the time, it's too much. But yeah, if you like your noise rock, your industrial music, please check this out. You Won't Get You Want by Daughters. Anthony Fantano, the music reviewing legend, gave it a 10 out of 10, which he never does. That might tell you something, or I don't know, make your own opinions, but it's amazing. IMO. I can't believe I said IMO. God, I'm such a loser. Daughters, you won't get what you want. Listen to it. It's really good. Bye.
Thank you for that, Sammy, and we'll tune in with Sammy once again next week on the My Generation podcast to find his next album review. You can get in touch with the Facebook page at the My Generation podcast if you've got an album that you'd like Sammy to listen to, or you can comment wherever you're listening on YouTube, Soundcloud, Spotify, or Apple Podcasts. And now, before we go back to Dan to continue the conversation about, different video games that not video games at all, different board games you can play with your friends, we're going to go to Harry Monday with his film review feature. Every single week, Harry brings a film to the show, and here is the film that he recommends this week.
Hi all, dear old Harry here. This week's movie recommendation is the Iranian masterpiece known as This Is Not a Film. And I say this is not a film because that is the most clever title I've ever heard. The context for it literally applies to the director is, of course, Iranian, as I said before, but he was put under house arrest and had his directing license stripped away from him, and it was made illegal for him to even hold a camera for the next few years. But this man simply got around it by just pulling out his phone and just filming a day in his flat. That's all he did, just a day in his flat of how he comes up with movies, how he visions them out, how he directs them in such a magnificent way. And simply saying it, this is not a film. This is just raw life in essence. In fact, this movie went through the cliche of having to be smuggled out of the country inside a USB stick that was inside a cake until it was delivered to France, where it was submitted for festivals. And it's just so mad to see this man just go through the whole creative process. It's just such an enlightenment way to sort of gain appreciation for what foreign media is and what the directing process is. To anyone who's not really that knowledgeable on it or wants to get more into foreign films, I would say this is an amazing place to start. go ahead and watch your Iranian masterpiece. This is not a film, straight away.
Thank you for that, Harry. And we'll tune in with Harry once again next week to find out what his next film review is. Do let us know in the comments what you think of the films and albums they review. If you've had a chance to listen or watch any of them, we'd love to know what you think. Later on in the show, we've got Emma Cusson, who does a poetry reading, Joe Finnegan with a video game review, and Tom Axtell, who does a pirate profile every single week on the My Generation podcast. So stay tuned for those later on in the show. So Dan, back to your list of board games and sort of different complexities. We're sort of now moving into the sort of 4 or 5 hour long games that take a lot of preparation. What game would you like to recommend for this?
This is where my personal experience is sort of quite limited, mostly because there's not a lot of point of having a lot of these games, because I'll play them maybe like once a year if I'm lucky. So within like my own personal collection, I probably only have one game that fits nicely into that sort of range bracket, which is another Traitor game, and it's the Battlestar Galactica board game. So I don't know if you're familiar with the Battlestar Galactica TV show from like the sort of early 2000s.
I'm somewhat familiar with it, but not enough to talk confidently.
That's fine. So basically the game itself, it's based off the TV show, the 2000s TV show. I think it's 2000s, I actually don't know. It's just something in my head. It might be earlier than that. It's a remake of a sort of an 80s show as well, so it's one of these ones where Battlestar Galactica's got a lot of history and therefore it's got a lot of fans. But no, this game is like when you sort of start, putting all the extra sort of. It's another game where it's had like five or six sort of expansions to it, and each expansion sort of can add on a healthy sort of chunk of game. So it's that sort of like you can sort of stretch this game out for as long as you want it to be. But yeah, so the sort of the vague story of it is that you're a group of humans trying to escape a robotic race called the Cylons. Now the big one is the Cylons can look like humans. So it's another one of these ones where at the start of the game everybody's dealt sort of loyalty cards, and then that can change whether or not you're a human or a Cylon, which then sort of changes whether or not you're looking to win or undermine, the humans. Now with various expansions, they kind of start messing with that a little bit and do some quite interesting sort of complex ideas. And it's one of these games where they they really build on that traitor mechanic by adding many different like layers and opportunities for players to kind of secretly influence people and influence outcomes, which just ends up in the situation where you have suspicion thrown on everyone. And one of the extra touches that I really enjoy about this game is about halfway through the game, everybody gets like a second dose of loyalty cards. So it's one of these ones where you'll be evaluating what everybody's doing, and you're being like, oh, I think, you were involved and there was no problems. You were involved and there was problems, and maybe I'm a little bit suspicious of you. But halfway through the game, suddenly everybody gets a fresh set of another set of loyalty cards. So you kind of have to start again from scratch. Like you kind of have to restart evaluating everyone whilst remembering what you had before. So it's that. Because the other side of it as well is obviously the nice thing with traitor games is you can be a traitor and just play to win, like have the good guys win for a little while. So that way you don't kind of accrue any sort of suspicion at all. So there's that sort of, so people will be looking for somebody to like, put a foot out of line. But if you just don't, it makes everybody just so much like you, because if you can wait long enough, people kind of forget a little bit about the traitor, and then you can start kind of, start making things go wrong, at which point then you have that opportunity to almost act with impunity for a little bit. But yeah, with the Battlestar game, it's a lot of fun because it shakes the game, it shakes it up halfway through. So even though it's quite a long game, it keeps it fresh and keeps it going forwards. Because you have that layer of that sort of like reassessment. The whole who's the traitor never gets boring because you're kind of having to constantly re-guess anyway. And yeah, coupled with that, like the mechanics for the game itself are sort of a lot of fun. There's a lot of sort of plausible deniability, and there's a lot of opportunities where only certain players get to make choices. So again, it really encourages the table talk, because that player might be like, well, I don't want to rock the boat, so what does everyone think I should choose? Or even when people make brash decisions, again, it's that sort of, that could just be that player acting with well, I know what I'm going to choose, but from the outside, it can be very quickly like, that's super suspicious, and you didn't talk to anyone about it, you just made a decision. And it's the game itself has like you're constantly managing various resources. You've got different sort of actions and player sort of agency. And as a fan of the TV show, I find like a lot of the mechanics built in very sort of flavourful and very sort of on theme, and as such sort of super enjoyable. And then it's also got the wonderful moment where it's got some really nice playing pieces. I like it. The artwork on it is fantastic. The sort of especially with some of the expansions, the playing pieces themselves are sort of super like flavorful and like on theme. So it's got this, for me at least, it's got this wonderful sort of combination of factors that make it a super sweet game.
Amazing. Well, that sort of covers then all the sort of ranges, and it's nice that it still keeps fresh, because I've never really played any games that have sort of lasted that sort of 4 or 5 hour length. But it's good that it's got a mechanic in the middle of it that shakes the entire experience up. And I imagine because it's Battlestar Galactica's probably got this big expanded lore that there's so much going on that like a hardcore fan can notice when in the game as well. Yeah.
Yeah, so one of the big ones is like in the TV show, certain characters are by default kind of very suspicious because that's how their characters have been written. So within the board game, they've got a mechanic where they kind of get effectively an extra loyalty card, like they get dealt an extra loyalty card, but you build the deck with more cards, sort of thing. So it's one of these ones where it's just inherently the characters are more sort of like likely to be the traitor, but you're not guaranteed. So again, as a if you have a double loyal player, you'll be sitting there thinking, look guys, I'm loyal, trust me. And everyone's like, yeah, sure, you're just more likely to be a traitor than any of us. You'll be like, well, yes, but trust me, I'm on your side.
Amazing.
And yeah, it's another one of these games where you can play it with, I think, again, up to something absurd, 12 players. So again, as with any game, as you start adding in more and more players, the amount of time it takes sort of exponentially grows. So I've never actually had the pleasure or sort of pain of playing a game with that many players. But I have played it before with 6 or 7, and yeah, that took most of an evening, most of a day, to be honest.
Oh, that'd be so interesting to see a 12-person one go on. It would almost feel like a TV series within itself, really.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's where the fact that it's based off a TV show was a little bit gimmicky. Again, if you're a fan of the show, it's just super fun as well. It's that if you can get a group of people who care about the characters and know about them, it's that sort of it adds the extra dimension to the game really nicely.
And for someone like me who's sort of a super casual board game fan, who I've only really sort of played the sort of lower end of the scale games, like one of my favourite is Taboo, because it's a game that's super quick. What would you recommend for someone who was maybe looking to take that transition from sort of the quicker games into something a little bit more complicated? Where's the sort of best place to start? What's the sort of best thing to do if you don't really know where to begin?
If you have no idea at all, the internet is obviously a super powerful tool. There's a website called Board Game Geek, which basically is the resource of games. They have very comprehensive lists, very sort of thorough community rating system, so you can kind of work out what's the best game. They do very well at sort of describing the games, as well as sort of just giving you the opportunity to sort of look up a few basic kind of reviews without giving away too much. The other one that I use a lot is there's a board game review sort of channel on YouTube called Shut Up and Sit Down, and I think they are for me they are very close to the play styles. So this is what I find really interesting about board gaming, is everybody gets something slightly different from different games, and people prefer getting certain things from certain games. So I'm a very different gamer probably from, let's say, you. What you get out of a game might be very different from what I get out of a game. And as such, the games that I look to purchase and play are going to be the games that, play to what I like. So I know plenty of people who aren't a fan of the traitor mechanic. They're just sort of it's a bit kind of gimmicky and it's a bit repetitive, and once you've played one, you've played them all, sort of thing. But for me, I find that my sort of play aligns quite closely with some of the team from Shut Up and Sit Down, and as such, I watch their reviews very closely and use that to sort of not influence, but when I see a game when they because they do a very good job at sort of playing you through the mechanics of the game and giving you a feel for how the game plays. And that sounds so weird to say how a game feels, and I don't mean like, the physical playing pieces in your hands, but like how the mechanics unfold and how it kind of makes players feel as they're playing the game. Which is kind of like, again, it's a strange thing to think about, but it's kind of the same. It's the same with sort of video games in a lot of way. Like the things that are great about roleplay games is that it gives you that feel of like choice and that kind of the feel of influencing everyone around you and making the decisions. Whereas like faster games are giving you that feeling of adrenaline, that rush, that sort of like in the heart of the moment sort of thing. But yeah, so the internet, super powerful tool when you're sort of looking it up. The other one as well is find out where your local board game shop is. So for me, in Canterbury, there's the Dice and Destiny, which I go to buy most of my games. And if they don't have them, I usually buy them online. But again, they're very, like, it tends to be, this is people's businesses, they're very knowledgeable about what games they've got in stock. And they usually have, like, a good range of games out in those shops, some for beginners, some for intermediates, and then some for the more complex and advanced games. And I also know for a fact that, like, so for instance, with the Dice and Destiny, they also have a board games night, so you can go along, sit down and play with people. So even if you're not sure on what games you want, it's a good way of trying a few games, like finding out what games you enjoy playing, maybe trying some of those slightly more complex games, because that's the other side of it. Is buying a board game is kind of like, it can be a bit of a big commitment, because first of all, they can take up a lot of space. Secondly, a lot of the times they're not super cheap, and so you don't want to spend your time and money getting a game and then finding out that actually none of your friends enjoy playing it, and you might again only play it sort of once or twice, because that kind of ends up being quite expensive. Because the other side of it as well, board games don't have a great resale, because obviously once it's open, you can't kind of guarantee that all the pieces are there, any damage. So it's a very much sort of limited. But then that's where these board gaming clubs are so sort of powerful, because it gives you that platform to try games and work out what kind of games you like. And there's also like board games cafes as well around. There's not so many of those in Kent, although I have been to one in London, and there was one up in Sheffield as well that I went to. And again, they tend to have on site very knowledgeable, very good collections. So you can just say to them, like, we're looking for a casual game, 4 players, about half an hour, and they'll usually have a list of games sort of ready to go. Which again, I think is such a nice thing for the community to have out there, is this sort of space and platform where you can just sort of tinker and try out games.
Yeah, I feel like that's so interesting, because I feel like something you're making me realise in this conversation is that I've sort of subconsciously been pushing myself and my groups towards the kind of games that we really, really enjoy, those sort of half an hour long, quite simple in the moment games, because I hadn't ever really sort of thought about the mechanics of the video games, the board games we were playing before, and why we enjoyed them. And so, yeah, that's super interesting. And obviously, you've, like you said, you sort of prefer the more complex ones.
Yes. Well, so for me, I think my favourite games are the ones that ride that line, like have just enough complexity to be a bit more than just these sort of simpler games, but there are games that take that too far. Like there are some games that just go right down the rabbit hole of mechanics, and you have like these huge rule books where you have to spend ages flicking through to try and understand what's going on. For me, there's this nice sort of like middle ground where you have just enough rules to make it a bit more complex, but simple enough that it feels intuitive. It's not too hard to explain. Because ultimately, board games, you're playing with other people. As much as I might enjoy a really complicated game, the fact is I pretty much know that I don't have many friends who are also going to enjoy that, and so therefore I'm not going to get a chance to play that game. So there's no point in me trying to like pursue those games too much, because I know that people aren't going to want to play it. Whereas if I can find that sort of back step a little bit, and sort of that range of slightly more complex but not quite so difficult, you get that sort of nice middle ground.
Yeah, that's so interesting. So yeah, once lockdown is all lifted, if you're interested in exploring this further, go to your local board game shop and explore, because yeah, that's a great way to get started. Well, we're going to go back to Dan in just a moment to keep going with the conversation. Still got a few more questions for him, but now we have some of our newer features on the show. It's Emma, Joe and Tom. They've only been on the show for a couple of weeks, so do let me know if you've been enjoying their features about this time of the show every single week. week, Emma brings a poetry reading. Emma is a local poet from the sort of Thanet area. She's performed some of the poetry that she's doing here on the show live in Bramley's in Canterbury, and here is the poem that she'd like to share with us this week.
It's funny how long you can know someone of someone. A glance across the room, an acquaintance in the crowd. The sorry after you jig in the doorway you both so happen to be passing through. A stranger on the lips, dancing behind your teeth and on your tongue, gestured in the most unlikely of conversations. Stranger to your hips, and oh how they move when you become lost amongst music. But life threw us into the most unlikely of situations. You were my partner in geography, now my partner in crime. You was my secondary school crush. Well, you still are, but now I don't have to admire you from afar. The person I would double take to as you pass me by. Now the person with the welcoming fragrance as we hug after a long goodbye. Do you remember how we met? Falling behind your work just because you wanted to annoy me for one moment longer. I say annoying blindly, as there was nothing annoying about the smile you put on my face. It's unlikely to think we dance in the same solitary summer fields to bands oh so loud. Now you're the one holding my hand, guiding me through the crowd. And I believe you hated me once. Did I get that right? Now I'd hate to think of life without you if I'm completely transparent. It's unlikely at best how long you can know someone of someone before they become a significant someone. This poem is called Unlikely, and I dedicated it to my friends. There's a part of each of them within the words.
Thank you for that, Emma, and we'll tune in with Emma once again for her next personal poem account every single week here on the My Generation podcast. Next we're moving on to Joe Finnegan. We've been talking obviously about board games in this episode, but every single week Joe recommends a video game that you should be playing here on the podcast from a wide range of genres, styles and platforms. So here is the game that Joe recommends this week.
Hello. The game I'm recommending today is Fall Guys, an insanely fun party multiplayer game. You play as a weird looking jelly bean character who can be dressed up with all kinds of outfits, and you race or fight against 59 other jelly beans to determine who will be the last bean standing. There are a number of different minigames in all. I think there's about 18 in total, although developers have said that this will be added to in the future. These games can range from team games, such as a football spin-off where your team has to put an oversized ball into the other team's net. Then you also have racing events where you have to fight through obstacle courses similar to that of Takeshi's Castle or Total Wipeout on TV. There's such a huge range of gameplay to this, and by adding up to 3 friends in your party, you can share the fun with your friends as well. Fall Guys is currently available on PS4 and PC only.
Thank you for that, Joe. So excited to hear what the rest of the video games you're going to recommend are on the show. And please do let us know if you've checked out the game that he recommends, what you think of it. And our last feature, before we go back to Dan to sort of start to draw toward the end of the episode, is Tom Axtell. Every single week he brings this really crazy new feature we've got on the show, Pirate Facts and Profiles. On the 1-year anniversary of the My Generation podcast, we found out that Tom was a little bit of a pirate enthusiast, and so now every single week on the show he brings you a profile or a set of facts from the history of piracy.
Hello, and welcome to Tom's Prolific Pirate Profiles. Today, we are talking about John Martel. John Martel was, like many pirates, a privateer during the War of the Spanish Succession, and he turned to piracy after the war had been finished and the Treaty of Utrecht signed. Martel was active in Jamaica by September 1716, and took various ships with his 8-gun, 80-man sloop. The first recorded act of Martel's piracy was attacking a galley called the Berkeley and another sloop named the King Solomon. Martel slowly gained a fleet and often forced captured sailors to serve under him. Martel, like many pirates, was known for his cruelty. He once apparently killed the entire crew of a merchant vessel he had captured for seemingly no reason. In late 1716, Martel pulled into St. Croix to resupply. Here, Jamaican officials were tipped off to his location. They released the HMS Scarborough under the command of Francis Hume to hunt him down. Hume found Martel, and after sinking one sloop, Hume anchored offshore. Martel tried to use this opportunity to flee with his flagship, but he ran aground. He ordered the ship to be burnt, but he left slaves on board in the cargo hold. Then he fled to a captured sloop where he and some of his men made their escape. The remainder of his crew hid on the island and waited for Hume to leave. These men may even have been recruited by pirates Samuel Bellamy and Palsgrave Williams. After this encounter, Martel disappears from history. Some claim that he may have accepted the king's pardon in 1717. That is the story of John Martel.
Thank you for that, Tom, and we'll tune in once again with Tom next week for the next pirate fact or profile. Thank you so much, Tom. That really fascinating new feature. Definitely excited to hear what you will think about Tom's new feature here on the show. So Dan, I just wanted to sort of go over then, what have been some of your favourite memories with board games? Have there been sort of certain moments, like we were talking earlier about how a board game feels, have there been certain times or just a certain run of a game that went so well that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I mean, so I've been playing since I was about 14. So yeah, there's so many like fantastic stories. So like tricky to talk about any sort of one in particular. I think the ones that stand out is when I was sort of 20 and in my third year of university, I was working at a pub in London, and I found out that some of my sort of colleagues, like one of my colleagues in particular, was another sort of big board gamer, and he started talking about this game. And he's like, "Oh, I played this game one time; it was wonderful." And as he was describing it, I realised that I had it in my own collection. That we were sort of continuing to talk about board games, and he was like, "Oh, we should all, get together sometime and play games." So we did that. We organised a day where we had, I think it was about 8 or 9 people come along and play, and he brought a load of games. And I didn't tell him that I had this game, so I brought it along as well. And in the end, I just sort of cracked it out, and he was like, "Oh my god!" So we sat down and played that, and it was one of these ones where I could just like, when you're like someone, he was like so into it, as well as like obviously he told all of his friends, so all of his friends were really excited to play it. So seeing them play through that's always a really good one. What else? I think, more recently, I started playing games with people from work, and in those situations, there's been a few games where literally we've had to stop the game because we're all just like flat out crying with laughter, and that was actually Exploding Kittens. Like, it's one of these very early, very quick, very sort of fast-paced games, but it's one of these ones that gives people this platform to be just out mean to each other, which is just a source of much laughter and much of back and forth. So that has just gone. That's gone really well. Because it's that sort of like when you're at work with these people, they're obviously quite, not quiet, but you know who they are. They kind of get on with it, do their bits, but suddenly when they're playing board games with them, it's a lot more sort of cutthroat and a lot more sort of like, I've never seen this side of you, and it could be a bit sort of funny and sort of interesting in that sense. As well as, whenever I sort of have gone on sort of holidays with friends, weekends away or whatever, especially when, we've gone before and it's just, rained the whole time, so we're like, well, looks like we're board gaming, but, having those games where it's almost full-on arguments across, no, you're doing the wrong thing, you should do this. But then, come the end game, you'll just laugh about it and be like, man, we were super into that, super, intense into that. As players are arguing over whether or not to sell some sheep to this person. It's literally just arbitrary things where you're just you're so intense into it. But it's that sort of take a second to actually think about it. You're like, oh, I guess it doesn't really matter. It's a game, but the passion that comes through can be so so sort of visceral sometimes.
Yeah, I think that's, to me, what makes board games so special, that immersion with something that isn't even physically there. I feel like when you're sort of watching a film or, playing a video game, you can obviously see the graphics in front of you. But with the board games, you're almost creating the image in your head, like almost like reading a book, where you're given all this information and you build up that image. So like I used to actually and I've done a little episode on the podcast before about this, I used to write murder mysteries, and I used to perform them in little local like pubs and cafes in Canterbury, and watching people take my characters and start taking them really seriously and thinking about, you know, oh, would they do it, what would they do, and seeing all the concentration and all the teams like arguing and backfiring and trying to race to get to the answers before the other teams. That competitiveness, when really all it was a few bits of paper with writing on it, is something so special.
Yeah, like I say, when people have that emotional connection to it, I say in that sense as well, board games can, like, obviously you've got some playing pieces to help kind of create an environment and sort of help channel that sort of focus. But this is where even like board game piece like design can often just change like so much about it, because sometimes there are some very sort of minimalistic games, but because they're so minimalistic, it kind of, I don't know, it makes it feel so much more sort of like this collective experience, because there's not a lot going on that feel on the table. It is about that chatter around the table. Like with the Sherlock Holmes games I'm playing with my family, it's all just about us talking to each other. But that means it makes it feel more sort of like we're uncovering the story. We are the detectives. Like we are, like, you know, talking things out. Like, oh, could it mean this? Should we go here? Oh, but what if it means this and we're going here? So even though there's no real board to it, it makes it feel much more alive, because we're all coming up with ideas and we're sort of bouncing off each other.
Yeah, and I think that was a sort of a major part for my murder mysteries too, just letting people speak, and that connection is something quite special, because you are actually literally building the story in front of you. Oh, that's really great. I think that's going to lead really nicely into my final question then, which is really, what do you think the future then is for board games? What direction are we heading in with them? Are they getting more complex? Are the stories and designs getting different? What do you think is the future?
So, I mean, we are like living in the golden age of board games. Like the games that are coming out over the past sort of 10 years are just all like are so good. Like mechanics are innovative, pieces are elegant, rules are just sort of fantastic. One of the big recent developments in terms of like board game design is a concept called legacy games. It started off with like Risk Legacy, sort of in the early sort of 2010s-ish. I can't remember exactly when it came out, but it was sort of, I think, personally, it was sort of best handled in a game called Pandemic Legacy. So Pandemic is its own game in its own right. So Pandemic Legacy is Pandemic, but with a legacy element. And basically, legacy games are games that ultimately you can only play a certain number of times. And basically, as you're playing through the game, the first time you play through the game, it's kind of just like the base game. But decisions you make and actions that you take allow you to physically affect, mark, change, develop the board. So Pandemic is a game all about stopping a disease from taking over the world, or like multiple diseases. And the legacy elements of it is stuff like the more times you beat a disease, you can upgrade it. You know, you can make it easier to treat going forwards. The characters you use pick up injuries, which means in games, like in all future games, they have like this weird quirk that allows them, you know, they're not allowed to move to a certain location, or if they do, they have to do X, Y, and Z. Like, so it's one of these ones where the first time you play through the game, it's kind of just the base game. But the second time, it's a little bit different, because you've got the decisions and the way that dice rolls happen and the way that random things occur. You end up with this different element. And then the third time you play the game, it changes, it, you know, builds on each last game, developing and changing the game. And what it also means is a lot of developers use the legacy format to tell a story. So like the Pandemic Legacy is told over what is effectively 12 months. So each game that you play is supposed to be a month. So in theory, you play 12 games. Now, it actually works out as being more sort of up 20, because every time you lose a game, you get a chance to redo the month. So you kind of get 2 goes at each month. But like as the time develops, you get sort of a story unfolding, as there are extra like components and pieces that often come in like sealed boxes. that it only tells you to open once you hit a certain time, or like once you complete a certain objective. It goes, now open box number 4, and then when you open that, it has a whole load of new pieces, a whole load of new rules, and it really changes and develops how a game is shaping. Like let's say, it allows the game developers themselves to tell a different style of story. Now, obviously, I don't want to go in too much, because this is the only thing, is it's very spoiler heavy. Like if you start actually talking about what it means. Because there's a certain sort of, obviously everyone's legacy games consist of that same story, but what's really unique and interesting about it is how that story unfolds is 100% customized to how you have played that game. Like, because it's based off random card pools, the actual mechanics of the game, those mechanics then develop how the story develops. So it's one of these ones where I've played this game and I've got another group of friends who are also playing this game, and we are sort of 3 or 4 games in, effectively our maps and our stories had completely diverged, because they drew a certain card, which meant that they had something happen in this region, and for us, when we drew that card, we had it mean that it happened in a completely different region. So suddenly our games are, like, even though we are playing the same game, they're completely different games to play. And you get these stories that build up over time of, like, we've got this one character that we use in this game over and over and over again, which means that we've spent the time and efforts to, like, upgrade this person so they're really efficient. But because we've used them so much, they've also picked up loads of, like, injuries and, like, loads of, like downsides of elements, which means we've got this, like, really grizzled veteran, and then suddenly when we're unlocking these new playable characters, you've got these sort of, you can just picture the interactions between these two characters. You've got this fresh-faced, new-eyed recruit and this, like, super, like, grizzled veteran with, like, one arm. But the thing is, it's like, so it means that as well as you getting that emotional response to playing the core mechanics of the game, you have all of this legacy, which is what they're called legacy games, all of this legacy behind you, which really, like, moves it forwards and, like, into the next step. Now, obviously, the big downside is that you say you can only play the games a number of times. But actually, one of the weird quirks is, over the course of sort of 5 or 6 years, most of my games I've maybe only played a half dozen times. Like, on a board games night, we might get through sort of 3 games. And we might do that once a month. And because everyone else has got games, it actually means that over like several years, you don't actually play the same game over and over and over again. So the sort of, if anything, the legacy game makes me want to actually play that game more than I would anything else. Because I want to see where that story goes. I want to see how that story ends, and I want to see what the last step on that journey is. So even though it sounds like it should be worse because there's only a finite number of games, what I've actually found is I've actually played it more because I want to know how that story ends and where it goes to.
Interesting, and it feels like it must be really rewarding because of how much time you've got to put into it.
Exactly, yeah. Like, this is what I mean by you've got this extra layer of emotional connection because you've got that legacy of, like, actually, do you remember all those hours we spent playing this game that gets us to this point? And because of the nature of a lot of these games, you have to make some really hard decisions. And you know that, like, you're sitting there discussing this decision, and you know that the decision you make here is going to have ramifications that last the entire season, like the entire campaign, like the entire legacy game. And the other super, like, terrifying and rewarding thing about legacy games is it frequently tells you to destroy pieces. So, like, you physically have to take cards and tokens and tear them up and chuck them in the bin because it represents stuff like character deaths and stuff like this. And it sounds silly, but there's something so, like, terrifying and exhilarating when you're told to destroy a piece, and you're like, oh god. Yeah, like, another legacy game that I was to start playing through is a game called I can't remember what it's called now, but it's basically all about pirates and, like, exploring.
We'll have to tell Tom about that.
Yeah. God, I can't remember it. Seafall. There you go. I got it in my head. It's all about like, you're kind of like pirates style. But the big one with it is it's also about, like, exploration. So you're exploring islands and finding out different traits about them. But you can also raid them and be a pirate. But the interesting thing with that is if you raid an area, the local populations will remember that it was you that raided them. So, like, going forward, they're going to be really resistant to you turning up, because they're like, no, I remember that time that you had just attacked us. But that's got, like, again, it's got these built-in layers of, you get to, like, name the islands you discover, you get to upgrade your ships, so you can have, like, faster ships or, like, more powerful, and everyone gets to upgrade their own stuff in their own way. So even though you all start off at the same layer, like the same level, like the same abilities, because it's all based on your own choices, you know, if you, even only 2 or 3 games down the line, you have a completely different set of, like, factions, because everybody's customized them to the way that they want to play. And, you know, the board has developed in a way that is, again, totally unique, because it's so, like, based off random decisions and random, like, outcomes, that you can't, like, again, no 2 games are ever going to be the same. Like, it customizes the game experience to that exact group of people.
Interesting. Well, I mean, that's an incredible way we're moving, because that adds another layer, as you said, the emotional connection that is going to make you go back to it in a way that I don't think any other video game can really draw you back. It's like a full-on story interactive experience. I mean, that is an incredible direction we're moving in, and I feel like more people need to know about these type of games, because I didn't know that this was happening, really.
Well, I say there's a relatively recent development. Risk Legacy was I think was the first one, which it was literally just takes the base game of Risk and adds these legacy elements where stuff like places that you destroy become, like, destroyed in games forward. Like, they're not as good as regular regions. You can set up, like, capitals and cities, and you also stuff like you get to, like, name continents and change things. So one game that I was sort of watching people play through, they decided to name the continent of Australia Africa. So they had Africa and Africa twice, because they just, as like a joke, they just named it Africa as well. But this is what I mean by, like, it allows you to have add those extra layers of, like, emotional connection with the games. And yeah, like, as a mechanic and a development, it's a relatively recent one, but I think it's a really exciting one, because it adds that layer of storytelling that you, like, as a gamer, you've always wanted to be there, like, you've always wanted it there, but has always sort of been a little bit sort of absent. Like, you have some games where you can play through, like, a campaign style, but it's always, you know, unflinching and unchanging. But the legacy element to it really, like, gives it the feeling of, like, life, like the game is changing to your reactions.
Yeah, and I think that this is something where, I mean, film is sort of gradually getting into this with, like, Bandersnatch, where you can sort of influence decision making.
Yeah, Bandersnatch, exactly. Yeah.
But the board game ones at the moment obviously can naturally be a little bit more sophisticated with the imagination of it, because you can physically do it in front of you and change that story. So I guess all of that trailblazing, that the complexities of interactive stories, is all sort of starting with board games and then is transcending across to other mediums. So watch the board game space, I think is the message. Now, I've got one more question I do want to ask Dan to sort of close the episode. I just want to tease ahead to a few more topics that we've got coming up on the show. Aaron Frith, who we found at the end of his episode about swing and jazz music, he mentioned that he was an extra on the film 1917, which was kind of a bit of a bombshell to end the episode on. So we knew we had to do a full episode on it, and that's coming up in just a couple of weeks, so stay tuned for that. So before we go back to Dan, just asking one more question and wrap up the show, there are future topics that we're still looking for people to talk about. I want to talk to more musicians from different parts of the industry. Are you a music producer? Do you do music videos maybe? Or are you a musician yourself? If so, and you're between the ages of 18 and 35 and live in Kent, we'd love to hear from you, so get in touch with the Facebook page at the My Generation Podcast, and we can potentially get you on to talk about your muse. Again, all the links are in the description. So my final question, Dan, is what do you think you've learned by talking about board games here on today's show?
Well, the big one is I, like, reassessing, like, I was trying to pick, like, games for that sort of different, like, play styles and durations, and, like, really, like, going through and assessing, you know, what are my favorite games. One of the big things I learned is that I don't actually own a lot of my favorite games. Like, a lot of the games that I have the best emotional response to, I don't actually own, mostly because they're owned by my friends. And if anything, that kind of showed me maybe, like, to some extent, like, maybe this is why these are my favorite games. It's because I know that when I play them, I have those, like, I'm hanging out with my friends and having the fun like enjoying the company that I'm with as much as I'm enjoying those games. It's actually the social interaction side of it, the being with other people and having a good time. But yeah, like really like assessing like my own collection, like where the strengths and weaknesses are within my own collections of games. So I don't have that many of the shorter style games because as a slightly more avid gamer, I don't sort of worry too much about the shorter games because I don't really mind about them too much. But again, like assessing whether or not that's, you know, like what I'm missing, and actually I could probably plan to get a few more of the shorter games because they actually do fit nicely into these like niche times that otherwise kind of get wasted. So yeah, like really like reassessing what elements about games I enjoy. You know, what is it about this game in particular that I like over, say, like this game?
Amazing. Well, I think that the board game community is still clearly vibrant, and it's gonna, you know, once the sort of lockdown measures are lifted, it's only gonna go from strength to strength. As obviously we're recording this on the 25th of May for context. But yeah, Dan, thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing your story.
Always happy to.
Lovely stuff. Well, we've got so much great stuff coming up, but board games are clearly super vibrant. You can go find your local board game shop. Dan, is there anywhere on social media people can connect with you to maybe find out more about board games, or if you're thinking about, you know, discussing board games, anywhere they can go?
I've not really thought about that. I guess I'm just on Facebook, Daniel Collins. Feel free to drop messages, but ultimately there are so many different communities out there. Yeah, my best advice is find your local community and speak to them, because my experience amongst various communities across the whole country has been that there are some extremely knowledgeable, enthusiastic and knowledgeable people out there. Find the ones local to you, because yeah, board games is all about talking face to face, so I always advocate starting there.
Amazing. Well, thanks so much, Dan. We're going to definitely keep that conversation going, because board games is something that I've been wanting to talk about for ages, and so glad we got to this discussion. So that's it. That's board games here on the show. We've got Doctor Who Part 2, Chamois, and being a film extra on a feature film set. So much great stuff coming up here on the show. Do let us know what you're thinking of the episodes. Really excited to share all this content with you going forward. That has been me and Dan, and we will tune in with you on next Thursday's episode for the next show of the My Generation podcast. Thanks so much for listening.